Hey guys, tonight we're climbing aboard a Viking longship. A narrow wooden plank floating in freezing water packed with armed men, damp wool, fermented drinks, and absolutely no toilets. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. At first glance, a Viking longship looks like a terrible idea designed by someone who actively dislikes hygiene. It's long, narrow, open to the elements and packed with men who have been sweating in wool for weeks. There are weapons everywhere, food barrels rolling around, no walls, no toilets, no comforting illusion of personal space. If you describe this setup to a modern health inspector, they would simply sit down and stare into the middle distance. And yet these ships crossed oceans not gently, not quickly, but repeatedly, carrying crews across the North Sea, the Baltic, and even the Atlantic without turning into floating hospitals filled with groaning, feverish men begging to be thrown overboard, which is impressive because later ships with actual toilets somehow managed to do much worse. Historically, cramped travel spaces are perfect disease factories. Waste builds up, food spoils, water turns suspicious. Skin breaks down. Someone gets a cut. That cut gets infected. Suddenly, half the crew is reconsidering their life choices. This happened constantly on medieval and early modern ships, but not on Viking longships, at least not nearly as often as you'd expect. The reason wasn't Viking super immunity or a special diet of raw courage. It was something far less romantic. They refused to let anything sit long enough to become a problem. Vikings didn't design ships for comfort. They designed them for movement, constant movement, relentless movement. Nothing stayed still long enough to rot, including the crew, emotionally. The ship itself worked against disease. The open deck meant wind was always blowing. Surfaces dried quickly. Smells didn't linger. They fled for their lives. Sunlight hit everything directly, which germs famously hate, even if Vikings didn't know why. Salt spray washed across the deck like nature's extremely aggressive cleaning solution. And most importantly, the ship was not treated like a home. Homes collect clutter. Homes tolerate mess. Homes allow you to say, "I'll deal with that later." A Viking longship did not. Anything unpleasant was removed immediately, usually by introducing it to the ocean. To Vikings, the ship was a temporary survival device. Not a cozy space, not a living room, not somewhere you emotionally unpack. It was a narrow wooden agreement between humans and the sea that said, "We will not make this worse than it already is." And surprisingly, that agreement worked. After accepting that Viking longships looked like floating hygiene violations, the next step is realizing that their most dangerous-looking feature, the open deck, was actually the thing keeping everyone alive. What looks primitive from a modern perspective turns out to be aggressively practical. Later ships tried to be comfortable. They added enclosed decks, cabins, walls, privacy. And with those luxuries came trapped air, damp corners, and a slow but steady buildup of smells that suggested something had gone deeply wrong. Viking ships skipped all of that. They were open to the sky, the wind, and whatever weather the sea felt like throwing that day. This meant one thing above all else. Air never stopped moving. Wind swept constantly across the deck, drying surfaces before bacteria could settle in and start a little community. Sweat evaporated. Damp clothing dried faster. Moisture, which germs absolutely adore, had no chance to linger. It was immediately bullied off the ship by the North Sea. Smells, too, were temporary. Anything unpleasant was not allowed to hang around and emotionally scar the crew. It was carried away by winds so fast that no one had time to complain properly. You might smell something terrible for a moment, but by the time you opened your mouth to say something rude, it was already gone. Problem solved. Sunlight was another accidental hero. Viking longships spent long hours exposed directly to the sun, which hit the deck, benches, ropes, and shields with relentless enthusiasm. Sunlight is a natural disinfectant. Vikings did not know this scientifically, but they absolutely knew that things left in the sun smelled better and caused fewer problems. Empirical science at its finest. The open deck also meant no dark. damp corners where rot could hide and multiply. There were no secret spaces for mold, mildew, or suspicious slime to develop personalities. 0 hours 5 minutes and 26 seconds, everything was visible. Everything was exposed. Everything had to behave. Of course, the downside was obvious. Rain fell directly on you. Cold air ignored your feelings. Waves occasionally slapped the deck like they were offended by your existence. Comfort was minimal, but comfort wasn't the goal. Survival was. Vikings understood something later sailors forgot. Sealing people into wooden boxes at sea does not make them safer. It makes them sick. Viking ships forced cleanliness through exposure. If something was wet, it dried. If something smelled, it vanished. If something became a problem, everyone noticed immediately. The open ship didn't just carry Vikings across oceans. It quietly prevented their ship from becoming a floating petri dish. And that alone gave them a massive advantage. If there was one unbreakable rule on a Viking longship, it was this. Nothing unpleasant was allowed to hang around. Not people with bad attitudes, not rotten food, and absolutely not bodily waste. Vikings understood in a very practical way that sickness starts when filth lingers. So, they made sure it didn't. Later, sailors would invent complicated systems for storing waste, hiding it, or pretending it wasn't there. Vikings chose a simpler solution. 0 hours 6 minutes and 50 seconds, when someone needed to relieve themselves. They did not look for a corner, a container, or a polite excuse. They leaned over the side of the ship and let the sea take it immediately. No middle steps, no backup plan. This was not optional. This was routine. The ocean was not scenery. It was infrastructure. Solid waste went straight overboard. Liquid waste followed. Nothing was saved for later. Nothing was managed in the modern sense. Vikings had no interest in inventing a floating problem that could ferment, spread, or come back to haunt them during a rough wave. And yes, this required coordination. You didn't just wander off and hope for the best. Timing mattered. Balance mattered. A sudden wave at the wrong moment could turn an ordinary day into a personal saga that followed you for the rest of the voyage. Mistakes were remembered. Nicknames were earned, but the system worked because waste never stayed on board long enough to contaminate food, water, or sleeping areas. There were no buckets sloshing around. No hidden corners quietly becoming biological experiments. No accumulation. The moment something became waste, it stopped being the ship's problem. Food scraps followed the same rule. Bones, shells, gristle, spoiled bits, all gone. 0 hours 8 minutes and 16 seconds, the ship was not a trash bin. If it wasn't actively useful, it left quickly. This constant removal prevented insects from gathering. No flies, no rodents setting up camp. No smell strong enough to sink morale. The ship stayed relatively clean, not because Vikings scrubbed constantly, but because they refused to let dirt exist long enough to organize. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't dignified, but it was effective. Vikings didn't talk about hygiene the way we do. They didn't theorize. They didn't moralize. They observed results. Crews that kept waste moving stayed healthier. Crews that didn't last. So, they built the rule into daily life. Waste leaves the ship immediately. No exceptions. And in a world without medicine, that simple rule probably saved more lives than any charm, prayer, or heroic saga ever did. 0 hours 9 minutes and 12 seconds. Once you understand that Vikings refused to store waste on board, the next realization follows naturally. The ocean itself was doing most of the work. Not symbolically, not spiritually, very literally. The sea was the bathroom, the sewer, and the cleaning crew, all rolled into one vast, cold, judgmental system. To a Viking, the ocean wasn't just something you sailed on. It was an active participant in daily life. When nature called, you answered it by leaning over the side and trusting the sea to handle the situation with professionalism and zero follow-up questions. There was no porcelain throne, no curtain, no privacy, just wind, waves, and the quiet understanding that balance was important at this exact moment. This system worked because the ocean never stops moving. Waste dropped into it didn't sit nearby, plotting revenge. It was immediately diluted, dispersed, and carried far away. No stagnation, No buildup, no chance for bacteria to circle back and contaminate food or hands. The problem simply ceased to exist. It also helped that Viking longships rode low in the water. Anything released over the side was gone instantly, not clinging to the hull or drifting lazily alongside like it might reconsider its options. The sea took it and moved on the way it always does. Food waste followed the same path. Bones from dried fish, shells, scraps of meat that had gone questionable. All of it went overboard quickly. The ship was not a landfill. It was a narrow platform where everything had to justify its presence. If it couldn't be eaten, used, or repaired, it was politely introduced to the North Sea. This constant clearing had a powerful side effect. Pests never had time to arrive. Rats, flies, and insects thrive on leftovers and waste. Viking ships offered them nothing. There was no trash pile to attract them. No lingering smell to signal opportunity. Even if something did fall on deck, it didn't stay long enough to become interesting. Of course, this system required discipline. You didn't delay. You didn't get lazy. You didn't decide, I'll deal with that later. Later was how people got sick. Later was not welcome on a longship. Was it dignified? No. Was it comfortable? Also, no. Was it effective? Extremely. The Vikings didn't need plumbing, chemicals, or written sanitation laws. They had something better. A moving ship, a moving sea, and a strict rule that said nothing unpleasant was allowed to linger. And as long as the ocean kept moving, so did their chances of staying healthy. On a Viking longship, food was precious. Food scraps were not. The moment something stopped being edible, it became a threat. Vikings did not romanticize leftovers. They did not believe in saving questionable bits just in case. If something smelled wrong, looked wrong, or felt like it might start a rebellion in your stomach, it was gone immediately. This wasn't wastefulness. This was survival logic. Rotting food is an invitation not just to illness, but to insects, mold, and a slow descent into misery. Vikings had learned, probably the hard way, that scraps hanging around long enough would turn a healthy ship into a floating apology letter to the gods. So, they ran a tight operation. After meals, bones, shells, cartilage, and anything too tough or suspicious to eat were tossed overboard. Fish guts gone. Moldy bread gone. That one piece of dried meat that tasted like regret. 0 hours 13 minutes and 4 seconds definitely gone. The ship was not a pantry. It was a transit space, and nothing stayed unless it earned its place. This constant clearing kept smells from building up. Smell matters more than people think. Smell is the first warning sign that bacteria are having a very good time. Vikings didn't need microscopes to know this. They followed their noses. If the ship started to smell off, something was already wrong. It also prevented pests from moving in. Rats, flies, and other opportunistic creatures rely on consistent food sources. Viking ships offered none. A rat might swim over once. It would find nothing to eat and immediately reconsider its life choices. Insects had no reason to gather. There was simply nothing for them. Food storage itself was designed to avoid spoilage. Dried fish, smoked meat, hard bread. Everything was preserved to last, not to impress. Fresh food was eaten quickly. Anything that couldn't survive a long voyage was consumed early or left behind. And here's the quiet genius. The open deck helped again. Airflow dried food faster. Sunlight slowed spoilage. Moisture, the true enemy, had nowhere to hide. This approach required discipline. You didn't get sentimental about scraps. You didn't hoard. You didn't experiment. You ate what was safe and removed what wasn't. Vikings understood something deeply practical. You don't get sick from hunger nearly as fast as you get sick from rot. So, scraps were treated like enemies. They were identified quickly and they were removed without hesitation. And that ruthless efficiency kept the ship healthy, one meal at a time. At this point, you might be wondering how Vikings handled drinking water, because surely that is where everything falls apart. Weeks at sea, wooden barrels, no refrigeration, no purification tablets. This should have been a disaster. And it would have been if Vikings had relied on plain water. They didn't. Vikings understood something instinctively that later sailors would repeatedly forget. Stored water goes bad. It grows things. Things with opinions. Things that make you regret every choice you've ever made. So instead of trusting water alone, Vikings leaned heavily on fermented drinks. Ale, beer, and other lightly fermented beverages were standard on longships. Not because Vikings were constantly partying, although morale certainly benefited, but because fermentation made these drinks safer to consume than stagnant water. The process killed harmful bacteria and created an environment that discouraged new ones from moving in and starting families. The result was a crew that was mildly buzzed, reasonably hydrated, and significantly less likely to die from waterborne illness. A strong strategic trade. These drinks were low in alcohol by modern standards. Think more liquid bread than blackout. Enough to preserve the drink and keep it safe, but not enough to make steering a longship feel like a personal challenge issued by the gods. Water was still carried, of course, but it was rationed carefully and consumed early in the voyage. Everyone knew it wouldn't last. Once it turned questionable, it was avoided. No one argued. Experience had already settled that debate. Fermented drinks also served another purpose. They masked unpleasant tastes and smells. If your cup didn't taste amazing, that was expected. It wasn't meant to. It was meant to keep you alive. Vikings were not picky. They were pragmatic. And let's be honest, a slightly sour drink was preferable to severe stomach distress in the middle of the ocean with no privacy and nowhere to lie down. Some problems compound. Vikings chose not to invite those problems on board. This system required planning. Barrels had to be sealed properly. Drinks had to be prepared in advance. Supplies had to be calculated carefully. It wasn't improvisation. It was logistics.